right, so picture this with me, okay?
Mm?
It's the 80s Cold War at the peak, and you see these photos of Soviet troops.
Right.
They're rolling into Afghanistan. But here's the thing.
Okay.
Some of those trucks, those like symbols of Soviet power, they have a very familiar logo on them. Ford.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Ford. Like that Ford.
Mm.
And that's kind of what we're diving into today, this whole idea of how American businesses, often, with some help from their own government, ended up basically supplying the Soviets during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a wild story for sure. And a lot of it comes from this book, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, by Antony Sutton.
Right.
And Sutton, just to be clear, wasn't some like conspiracy theorist. He was a serious researcher at the Hoover Institution.
Oh, yeah.
The guy dug through tons of documents, government archives, like you name it.
Wow.
And what he found was this pattern, like technology being handed over, financial deals, really a whole web of interactions between the U.S. and the USSR throughout, really, the entire 20th century.
So let me get this straight. We're talking American companies during the Cold War, like actively helping the Soviets. This wasn't just a case of, hey, we'll sell you this tractor, don't worry about what you do with it.
Oh, no. This goes way beyond tractors. We're talking blueprints, expertise, like the actual building blocks of Soviet industry.
Oh.
And their military, too.
Yeah.
And it started way earlier than you might think, back in the 1920s. The Bolsheviks had just taken over. The world's kind of freaking out, right?
Right.
And American businesses, they saw an opportunity.
It's just wild, to think that at a time when everyone's on edge about communism and everything, some people just saw dollar signs.
Yeah.
Were these companies just, like, naive? Or was there something more to it?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? There was this belief, I think, in certain circles that trade promotes peace.
Okay.
The idea was if we help the Soviets build up their economy, they'll kind of like mellow out. They'll become part of the system, less likely to cause trouble.
So the thinking was, if they're driving Fords, they won't invade Poland.
Pretty much, yeah. But of course, history tells a different story. And Sutton shows how this peaceful trade argument was often just a cover.
Okay.
Like, take a look at Ford Motor Company. Late 1920s, they're involved in building this huge automobile plant, the Gorky plant.
Okay.
And this wasn't just any factory. This thing was massive, designed to pump out like 80,000, even 90,000 vehicles every year.
Wait, Gorky. As in those trucks you see in those old photos from Vietnam. Those were Gorky trucks.
The very same.
Oh, wow.
The Ford-designed and equipped Gorky plant became like this central hub of Soviet vehicle production. Not just civilian cars, but the military trucks that'd later show up in conflicts all over the globe.
So even back then, in the 20s, there were red flags. Did anyone see this coming? Did anyone question giving a regime that was openly hostile to the U.S. that kind of industrial power?
I mean, it's mind-blowing to think about, right? Like, even with all those potential consequences, they just kind of went ahead with it.
Yeah.
Were they just oblivious, like totally ignored all those warning signs?
Well, you'd think, right. But there were definitely people speaking up, raising concerns.
Pointing out the obvious, like, hey, a truck factory, it can easily switch to making military vehicles.
Right.
But those worries were always kind of brushed aside,
Yeah.
Seen as like fear-mongering. Sutton actually found a whole pattern of this, like deliberate attempts to suppress information, to keep things quiet.
It's not just naivete, but more like, don't bother us with the facts. We're trying to make money here.
Yeah, you could say that. And it went way beyond just the auto industry. This pattern, it just kept popping up. Computers, jet engines, even the tools you need to make missile guidance systems. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Hold on. Missile guidance systems.
Yeah.
We're helping them hit things more accurately.
It's a tough one to swallow, but that's what Sutton uncovers. And get this, the Soviets, a lot of the time, they weren't even hiding what they were doing. They just come right out and say, hey, we need this technology.
Wow.
And American companies, often with a little help from their friends in government, they'd find a way.
It's less like free trade and more like we were giving away the farm. How does it go on for so long?
Well, the Gorky plant, that was just the beginning. Remember the Kama River truck plant? This was the 70s. Cold War's in full swing, right? And we cut this deal to help build what was, at the time, the biggest truck factory in the world. Even a Soviet defense official later on called this deal treasonous, said that without Kama River, they would have been, like, severely limited in their ability to fight wars, especially in places like Afghanistan.
So no hiding the military use there. Did anyone push back? Was there any attempt to, like, actually stop this?
There were a few folks. Sutton talks about this guy, Lawrence Brady. worked for the Department of Commerce in the 70s. He was really vocal about the Kama River deal, warning everyone about the military side of things.
And I'm assuming he was hailed as a hero for his, like, incredible foresight.
Not quite. More like the opposite. He was labeled a whistleblower, pushed aside, eventually forced out of the government altogether.
Yeah.
Kind of shows you how much pressure there was to just go along with things, keep your mouth shut, even when you're staring at a threat, you know?
It makes you wonder how many other people knew, but were too afraid to speak out. Did Sutton himself face any blowback for this? For bringing this all to light?
Oh, yeah. People tried to discredit his work, bury his research, even put pressure on his publisher to kill the book. This wasn't just some history project. It was touching a nerve, exposing something people didn't want out there.
So it was bigger than just a few companies cutting corners. This was like a whole system.
Absolutely.
Everyone benefiting from this weird arrangement.
Yeah.
But it's more than just money, right? This actually had real consequences out in the world.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary, honestly. Like, to think that American companies just chasing profits might have helped fuel a conflict that hurt so many people.
Right. It really makes you think twice about history, about why things happened the way they did.
But that peaceful trade idea, were people really that naive? Or was that just an excuse to do business with with a brutal regime? That's the big question, right? And Sutton lays it all out there. Companies made a ton of money from these deals, often knowing exactly what they were getting into. He even suggests that some people in charge in government and in these companies might have actually wanted a strong Soviet Union to counterbalance other powers in the world.
So kind of like that whole the enemy of my enemy kind of thing?
Exactly. But that brings up a whole other issue, like where do you draw the line? When does doing business become, like, morally wrong? Can you really put profit over human rights, over global security? These aren't just abstract ideas. They matter for how we act in the world today, too.
It makes you wonder if the same thing's happening now, right, with
Yeah.
other countries. Are we repeating the same mistakes, just chasing free trade and economic growth?
That's a question we got to ask ourselves. Sutton's book is like this warning sign. History repeats itself, especially when there's a lot of money on the line. We can't just take these words, free trade, globalization, at face value. We've got to look at what they mean for real people, too.
Definitely. So if you had to pick one big takeaway for our listeners from this whole deep dive into the best enemy money can buy, what would it be?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't just accept the way things are. Look for yourself, think for yourself, and hold the people in charge accountable. Whether it's the Cold War or what's going on today, our choices, they all have consequences. Learning from past mistakes, that's how we make better decisions now.
It's like they say, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, right? And this story, it's not just about the past. It's relevant today. So if any of this piqued your interest, go check out Antony Sutton's book, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. It's a bit of a dense read,
Yeah.
but it's a story that needs to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, it needs to be understood.